social challenges that Americans faced in the 1920s. And so, what this lecture video is now going to do is kind of talk about how some of those challenges were some additional challenges, and also really how Americans tried to address those challenges. So, by the 1920s, immigration in the United States had been kind of well established. Large scale immigration started back in the 1840s. And so as we get to the 1920s, there's millions of immigrants living in the country and millions of their descendants living in the country. So the population of the United States has jumped dramatically, and the urban population of the United States has risen to be a majority of the population. And when this happens, right, especially with all these immigrants coming in, there's a lot of poverty, right? These are poor people. And issue historically and currently with poverty-stricken areas is that alcoholism is a problem. And so, pretty much as soon as urbanization begins, as soon as these large-scale immigrations start occurring, something in the United States called the temperance movement develops. And the temperance movement was an effort by mostly white, middle-class Protestant women actually lead the temperance movement. Um, and the goal of the temperance movement is to stop people from drinking, right? To eliminate alcoholism. And so, leading up to the 1920s, individual states or local towns and communities might have passed laws or restrictions on the sale or consumption of alcohol, but they managed through a lot of political maneuvering, even though most Americans probably did not want this to happen to begin with, through politics and you know strategizing, they're able to get the 18th Amendment to the Constitution ratified. And this amendment prohibited the sale and consumption and production of alcohol in the United States. Pretty dramatic, right? So the whole country was dry. No one could drink anything. This proved to be almost impossible to enforce. The country is huge. People can make alcohol pretty easily in their own homes. And so it becomes very hard to enforce. It also leads to a lot of illegal crimes, right? Not only are individuals maybe producing their own batches of alcohol, but organized crime families like and this is where the mob families that are so associated with American culture, right? The Al Capones and those people, they get their rise to power with Prohibition and during Prohibition. They begin illegally importing or smuggling in alcohol from other countries. They organize large scale production operations and disseminate or distribute their illegally made or imported products to people in what were called speakeasies or secret bars or taverns, right? That were often hidden behind a wall or something like that, or in the basement of an ordinary looking storefront. It's relatively short lived, but it's about 13 years or so that the sale and consumption and production of alcohol is illegal in the United States. It's repealed by the 21st Amendment in 1933. Right, so I mentioned that temperance movement, which dates to the middle of 1800s. In January 1920, the 18th Amendment goes into effect. Um, and here we have some causes and effects that we covered a little bit before as well in the of Prohibition. Right, one element to this is kind of interesting, right, is that World War One we fought against Germany. There was many German immigrants in the United States at the time, so there was distrust there between native-born Americans and German immigrants. And also, German Americans kind of were some of the major producers of beer had breweries throughout the country. And so it was kind of seen as associated with an enemy group, so to speak. And so that encouraged people to kind of support it. Many religious groups thought drinking was alcohol could be sinful. If it wasn't sinful in itself, it could lead to sinful behavior. And so many religious groups supported the temperance movement as well. But it does lead to smuggling and bootlegging. Bootlegging is the illegal production of alcohol, and organized crime grows. Right, corruption grows because even plenty of politicians and police officers, right, don't want to prosecute people for this because they themselves patronize these speakeasies and things like that. So it becomes kind of a very corrupt period in that sense. This is really a cool historic image of a woman, right, who was smuggling alcohol, right, under her dress. They had these canisters they could tie around their waist, and then they would put a heavy coat over, and you would not necessarily know, by looking at this woman, that she had canisters of alcohol on her legs. Another kind of social tension that developed was between science and religion. During this time, this is kind of the period of in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, you have a lot of new scientific advances in thought and thinking. And one theory that is kind of put forward in the 1880s is evolution by Charles Darwin. And at the same time, you have this growth of a Protestant Christian group known as fundamentalists who interpret the Bible literally. So if you interpret the Bible literally, that is kind of hard to reconcile then the theory of evolution because they tell different stories. And so there's kind of a growing movement of fundamentalist Christians in the country, and they actually successfully managed to get certain places in certain states to ban the teaching of evolution in schools. Tennessee being one of those states in 1925. A biology teacher at the time, a man named John Scopes, decided to violate the law, and he taught, essentially to challenge the law, he taught about evolution in a class, and he was arrested. A really famous lawyer at the time, a man named Clarence Darrow, defended him, and another man who defended the fundamentalist perspective, who was prosecuting John Scopes, was a man named William Jennings Bryan, who had been a presidential candidate, and he was kind of a famous lawyer in America. And it was really a sensational trial. You can maybe equate it to the O.J. Simpson trial, if you guys have ever heard of that. Maybe the modern trial of Ghislaine Maxwell, if you've heard of that name before too, right? These are kind of famous trials that make the news, and this trial made the news. People all throughout the country were reading about it and debating it, right? And the scientific authority of the Bible was successfully challenged during this court case with Clarence Darrow. Regardless, though, Scopes was still found guilty, right? He still violated the law technically, and people at the time largely supported that law. And so it just kind of shows you the tension that can exist between science and religion, but not necessarily has to exist, right? I also want to emphasize this is fundamentalism, which is a group of Protestant Christians. This is not to say that other groups of Protestant Christians also believe this, right? That's not true. Plenty of mainstream Protestant groups, especially today, support and accept evolution, as well as Catholics. Right? The Catholic Church does not deny does not reject the theory of evolution. Right. So this is a group of Christians, not all Christians. That's important to kind of emphasize. Another kind of issue that we noticed, right, was women's rights. Right, the women's rights movement starts back in 1848, kind of formally, with the Seneca Falls Convention, in which women meet at this convention in Seneca Falls in upstate New York, and they kind of make a list of demands, right? And they kind of rework the Declaration of Independence to kind of say all men and women were created equal, right? That kind of concept, and it really begins formally this organized women's movement, which leads also to eventually the suffrage movement, which is the right to vote. So here we have a suffrage protest in 1915. A group of women marching in the streets of Manhattan to protest the fact that they don't have the right to vote. Kind of a cool historic image from over 100 years ago. This eventually leads from Seneca Falls in 1848, 72 years before the ratification of this amendment, it takes almost 3/4 of a century for this women's rights movement to result in the passage of the 19th Amendment, which says, quote, this is the entire length of the amendment, simple and straightforward. The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged, meaning altered, by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation, right? And this then gives the right for women to vote, and they begin using that right. Right. Just because women are allowed to vote does not mean they're suddenly equal in society, right? There are still discrimination, right? There's certain jobs that are open to them, limited education opportunities, and so on, right? And so the next generation of women take up this fight, and they're kind of known as flappers, right? These flappers are young women who reject kind of the gender norms of the day. They cut their hair short. They wear relatively short dresses. I mean, their short dresses would be long for modern standards, but still, it was different than what had been worn previously, right? And they did these things to kind of resist this discrimination, act out against it, right? And they become, in hindsight now, in historical hindsight, the flappers is kind of the most iconic image of the 1920s. So these are just some of the kind of key things and changes that have taken place during the 1920s. Prohibition, this growing tension between religion and science, and the women's right and women's suffrage movement.